Welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Sharon, and I will be moderating today. In pre-pandemic times, this weekly program was hosted by the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, ICSS, at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, California. During the pandemic, we have been meeting on Zoom. When the library reopens for in-person meetings, we intend to continue being online as well, what Zoom calls hybrid meetings. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our participants throughout the US and around the world. I'm a member of the planning committee that organizes these sessions, maintains the website, icssmarx.org, posts on our YouTube channel, ICSS Marxist, and keeps our financial records. For over a decade, Sunday morning at the Marxist Library has been a platform for diverse presentations and discussion on political economy, the fight against racism and imperialism, socialism, the environment, in short, much needed alternatives to the voices of the corporate capitalist media that surround us. We always welcome your feedback and suggestions. As a group, ICSS does not represent the views of any one organization, although we as individuals may express agreement with any number of different groups. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Gerald Horne. Professor Horne is Moores Professor of History at the University of Houston. He has published dozens of books. Today he will speak on his latest, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism, 2022, which has implications for California and Indigenous history and the prospects for a unique form of fascism. Gerald will speak for about an hour. Then after a short break for announcements, we will have another hour of questions and discussion. So please, everyone, welcome Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me. I doubt if I'll speak for an hour. I didn't.
I'm
not going to do my Fidel Castro imitation this morning. But thank you in any case for inviting me. And let me say that this book should be seen in the context of a lot of ideological ferment in the United States right now. Fortunately, better late than never. I think driven by January 6th, driven by the Trump phenomenon and its stickiness. So you have a number of folks who are rethinking what had been thought to be bedrock ideas. You look at your New York Times this morning, for example. There's a lengthy op-ed co-authored by Samuel Moyne of Yale Law School, who I believe was trained at Berkeley. And basically what the article says, you know what we used to say about that priceless Constitution? Never mind, forget about it. And this has been echoed in a recent book by Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School. His book is entitled The Broken Constitution. This is also reflected in a current controversy in the American Historical Association, which is the largest association of historians in the United States, perhaps the world, where the president, he uttered this typical liberal line where he was reprimanding the 1619 Project of Nicole Hannah-Jones, formerly of New York Times. I'm sure you know about it. And of course, the problem with many of these liberal historians, when they look at the past of the United States, they don't want to say, forget about the fact that the founders were enslavers. That's a bridge too far. So instead, they tie themselves up like a bowl of spaghetti and talking about identity politics and matters that hardly withstand the giggle test. And fortunately, what's happening is that a number of Black intellectuals in particular have been revising the traditional story of the United States of America. I think of the documentary by Raoul Peck, the Haitian intellectual, Exterminate All the Brutes, which I recommend highly. It's based in part on the book by your fellow Bay Area denizen, speaking of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, because what's interesting about a lot of our friends, not only liberals, but even friends on the left, they don't like to engage the Native American question. They don't talk about slavery and how it was horrible, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of the genocide, oftentimes they don't want to talk about it because it's difficult to fit into some sort of traditional narrative. And then your other Bay Area resident, Ishmael Reed, formerly of Berkeley, now of North Oakland, he did this spoof of Hamilton, the Lin-Manuel Miranda extravaganza, Broadway come Disney, which according to Ishmael sweeps Hamilton's enslaving proclivities under the rug. A former Bay Area resident, the late Tyler Stovall, formerly of both Santa Cruz and Berkeley, his book White Freedom, which I think the title encapsulates it all in terms of the critique of the fruits of 1776. And so given this ferment, I should say that my work also fits into this larger narrative because the counter-revolution of 1836 is a kind of complement, if you like, to the counter-revolution of 1776, the title of one of my earlier books. It's also a complement to my book on the 17th century, which re-examines the so-called Glorious Revolution in London in 1688, and consonant with the current scholarship, it talks about how partly what was at issue was that the merchant class was seeking to clip the wings of the monarch, which theretofore had a stranglehold on the insanely lucrative African slave trade, which they proceeded to do. And of course, it leads to a spectacular exponential increase in the number of enslaved Africans crossing the Atlantic, producing insane amounts of wealth, but of course also bringing with it a really unsustainable level of rebelliousness and restiveness. And the book is also consistent with the book I did on the 16th century, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, which talks in part about how this minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe was able to surge ahead, not only of the so-called His Catholic Majesty in Spain, but also the other power, speaking of the Ottoman Turks, and basically by, in a sense, cutting a deal with the Ottoman Turks, cutting a deal in particular with Morocco against the interests of the Songhai Empire due south in today's Mali in 1591, which of course leads to another exponential increase in the African slave trade, because that collaboration between Morocco and London resonates and has a ripple effect throughout the continent, well, at least as far south as today's Nigeria. So this book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, as the title suggests, picks up the story in the 19th century. And the story, in brief, is that Mexico had been controlling what is now Texas or Tejas, but made a blunder in terms of inviting to be settlers, the so-called Anglo-Americans led by Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston and other freebooters and cutthroats who wind up affixing their names ostentatiously to major cities. And what happens is that under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, Mexico in the late 1820s, early 1830s begins the process of seeking to abolish slavery, enslavement of Africans in particular. This does not go down very well amongst the settlers, the so-called Anglo settlers. And they do what Anglo settlers tended to do, for example, in the 18th century, which is rebel and, of course, dress it up in the finery of democracy and liberty and freedom. And and the other buzzwords that have confounded and baffled generations ever since, including people who should know better, people on the left in particular. And that leads to the creation of an independent state, the Republic of Texas, in existence from 1836 to 1845. Now, it's striking that during the brief existence of the Republic of Texas, the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star State, becomes a major enslaving power. Their flag can be found off the shores of Angola, Southwest Africa, which of course contributed mightily to the development of North America by dint of the African slave trade. Their flag could be found off the coast of Brazil. As I noted in my book, The Deepest South, the United States, Brazil, and the African slave trade, by the early 1840s, you had US nationals, and in fact, Texas nationals as well, who were basically controlling the supply of Africans to the largest market, speaking of Brazil. Interestingly enough, the minister, the ambassador from the United States to Brazil at that fraught moment was Henry Wise. Some of you may recognize his name. He was the man who presided in 1859 over the execution of the legendary John Brown. He was putatively against this expansion of the African slave trade. Why? Was it because he was a liberal, a progressive? Well, I just said he executed John Brown, so perish the thought. No, basically what's happening at that moment, and this also has impact on the history of Texas, is that the enslaving class was trying to turn Virginia into a so-called breeding colony, whereby Africans would be bred like bulls or cows, and then shipped to Texas or shipped to Brazil. In any case, the story of the slave trade is part of the story with regard to this book. But what you'll find is that the enslavers could not, in Texas, could not stand up to abolitionist pressure, not only from North America, but also from London and from revolutionary Haiti. And so what happens is that independent Texas crawls into the Union in 1845. As you may have heard at the Republican Party convention in Houston just a few weeks ago, the Republicans say they're going to put on the ballot next year a referendum for Texas to reestablish its independence. Now, before you begin to uncork the champagne bottles and celebrate, saying good riddance to bad rubbish, keep in mind that if that harebrained referendum passes, and in this state, you never know, I guarantee you that Texas will resume what it did during its brief period of independence, which is aligning with the most retrograde backward forces in the hemisphere. For example, if Bolsonaro is able to pull off his coup in Brazil, I expect that probably one of the first missions of independent Texas will be to establish a legation in Brasilia. And not to mention the fact that for reasons that come clear in my book, and hopefully will come clear by the time my remarks conclude, Texas has the largest Black population in the United States of America. And happening to be part of that population, I shudder to think what would happen under an independent Texas. So put the corks back in the champagne bottles, at least for my sake, before you bid Texas a fond farewell. Now, slavery is only part of the story that I talk about, and I'll come back to it again. But you also need to recognize that genocide is another part of the story, and herein you begin to see illuminated the subtitle, The Roots of U.S. Fascism. That is to say that the settlers in Texas had a formidable task in terms of confronting what may have been some of the most fearsome indigenous populations in North America, with all due respect to the Lakota due north. That is to say that the Comanches, the Apaches due west, the Caddo, C-A-D-D-O, we have an interlocking directorate with Black people. The Kiowa, K-I-O-W-A, many of whom wind up migrating to south of the border to Mexico. And so what happens is that Washington and some of the so-called liberals in Washington, they think that the better part of wisdom is to establish what in apartheid South Africa would have been called Bantustans, that is to say, Indian reservations. The real men with hair on their chests, which turns out to be a significant percentage of the settlers, think that's the solution of the wimp. They think that liquidation, annihilation is the preferred remedy, which they proceed to execute. And I think only the naive would suspect that in a country where actually, to be fair, the indigenous history of Texas is not particularly unique. I'm sure you in Northern California are, for example, familiar with the so-called Modoc War, M-O-D-O-C, which helped to clear the land for the arrival of settlers in the 19th century. And so, amongst others, of course, Benjamin Madley of M-A-D-L-E-Y of UCLA wrote a 600-page book talking about genocide against the indigenous of California. So only the naive would think that in a country which has already endured genocide would not be a candidate for a unique form of neo-fascism, particularly when one considers this. I was just listening to your station, KPFA, in Berkeley before I logged on. And you had a speaker who was trying to explain the Trump phenomenon without referring to class collaboration, for example. I mean, it's mathematically imprecise to suggest that the 75 million who voted for Trump in 2020 constitute 1% of a country of 330 million. That's imprecise, shall we say, euphemistically. And certainly if you look at January 6th, this attempted coup, it was a typical example of the kind of class collaboration that created settler colonialism in the first place. In my 16th century book, for example, I talk about London's first foray into this form of exploitation in the 1580s in what they called North Carolina. And of course, they came from various classes sponsored by the 1% of London. I've yet to encounter a settler who arrives on these shores and says, well, there might be a microscopic percentage of settlers who arrive on these shores and say, you know what, we need to align with the Native Americans against their dispossession. That was not the norm, shall we say. And please disabuse yourself of such naivete, otherwise we'll have plenty of time to discuss this in the concentration camps. In any case, so what happens is that this bloodiness ensues in the decades, particularly following Texas' ascension to the United States, circa 1845. And then, of course, you know that in 1861, Texas decides to secede again. It becomes the bulwark of the so-called Confederate States of America. And Texas, in some ways, was the Confederate state least damaged by the US Civil War. And in fact, to connect a point that I bruited a moment or two ago, what happens is that many, as the Confederacy was collapsing in Virginia, Georgia, the Carolinas, et cetera, you had many of the enslavers with their so-called property in tow moving to Texas, which was seen as a base of security, because keep in mind that in 1862, France, which had been a major supporter and backer of independent Texas, decides to occupy Mexico. That leads, of course, to the Chicano holiday. I'm sure you're familiar with Cinco de Mayo, marking a victory over Maximilian, the so-called emperor of France. And so what happens during the US Civil War is that from the port of Tampico in particular in Mexico, you had the enslaving class supplied and supported from that particular port, not only into Texas, but heading due east into the rest of the Confederacy. So what happens after Appomattox, which April 1865, the supposed end of the US Civil War, the Texas enslavers thought that they could cut a deal with French-occupied Mexico and move en masse to French-occupied Mexico and use that as a rear base from which to attack the US government headquartered in Washington. It's always somewhat curious, I think, that the folks who have repeatedly tried to overthrow the government are considered to be the staunchest patriots. I mean, obviously this makes no sense. In any case, what happens is that, and this also brings into play the federal holiday recently established, that is to say Juneteenth, which has a bit of mythology attached to it, unsurprisingly, because what happens with regard to June 19th, 1865, is that it would be as if Congress, and I don't want to put any ideas in the heads of these lunatics in Washington, Congress decides to pass a law saying slavery in Mauritania is abolished. Well, Congress has no jurisdiction over Mauritania, although we know the United States likes to interfere promiscuously in the internal affairs of sovereign states. And so when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, at least taking import then, the Lincoln government was not in control of Texas. So to say that General Granger shows up in Galveston and tells the Negroes, you know what, you people have been free. Well, yeah, thanks a lot, buddy. Tell that Confederate to get his knee off my neck, and perhaps I could exercise my freedom. So what happens, of course, is that Juneteenth is an attempt basically to enforce abolition more than anything else, not only in Galveston, which of course is infuriating because one of the most significant aspects of the US Civil War is that the enslavers were expropriated without compensation, except in Washington, D.C., where they were compensated. And in a capitalist society, if you want to infuriate those who hold property, you take their property without compensation, particularly if then you then say that this property is equal, and then the property is walking around telling the former owners, you know, we didn't never like you people anyway. And it was a recipe for bloodiness, which then of course begins to proceed and unfold in the years following June 1865. I should also say that Juneteenth has significance, but the Juneteenth I think we should mark is June 19th, 1867, because that's the day on which Maximilian, the French puppet, was captured by progressive forces under Benito Juarez, executed, and of course, there were Black soldiers on the northern border of Mexico in the uniforms of the blue, the US government, which was engaged in a kind of pincers action against the disloyalists led by Maximilian, and they finally succeeded, June 19th, 1867. And that actually was a day that put the United States closer on the path to abolition than June 19th, 1865. I should also mention that the French, as a result of their colonizing proclivities in Africa, not only, as noted, had been aligned with Texas before 1861, but they were sharing notes, because recall that France had occupied Algeria circa 1830, and the French and the Euro-American elites were exchanging notes about how to subdue indigenous populations, be they in North Africa or in Texas, for example. And so what's interesting is that during Maximilian's attempt to thwart being overthrown, France sends hundreds, perhaps a few thousand, Black troops from what is today's Chad to Mexico, some of whom wind up deserting. And there's a possibility that their descendants still are with us in Mexico and in Texas. Perhaps further research will bear that out. But in any case, to connect the previous thread, the bloodiness that unfolds in Texas post U.S. Civil War is breathtaking. Genocide against the Native Americans on the fast track. And in one of the most inglorious episodes in Black American history, you have the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, that is to say, Black Americans in the uniforms of blue, who are at the tip of the spear when the indigenous are being routed, particularly in West Texas. At the same time, their own people, speaking of Black people, are being lynched and routed in East Texas. How that unfolds, I think, is going to lead to a serious reevaluation of the leadership of Black Americans. And I can expand upon that if you so choose. In any case, what happens post-1865 is a new regime, that is to say an apartheid regime, a Jim Crow regime, which takes racist segregation to the levels of absurdity. For example, witnesses have to be sworn in on separate Bibles. Dogs have to be buried in separate cemeteries. It's all that you can really say is that there was serious talk, including under the Lincoln government, of deporting the Negroes en masse. There was talk with Brazil. I talk about that in my book on Brazil, by the way. There was talk about the DR, the Dominican Republic. That's in my book on the Dominican Republic and Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. But for better or for worse, they couldn't find anybody who would take us, so we're still here. And so I guess the best you can say is that perhaps because our labor was needed, because I think part of the key to arriving at a more adequate, accurate analysis of US history is to look at the question of class. That is to say, instead of being befuddled by the fact that the enslaved were Black, which really seems to throw people for a loop, look at them as unpaid workers. And so when you look at the Haitian Revolution, see that as a revolt of unpaid workers. And maybe then people can get some clarity with regard to this fundamental question. In any case, it's no accident that after slavery is abolished, that there's a bump in the success of unions when that albatross around the neck of organized labor is removed, a rise in struggles for the 8-hour day, for example. But that's the whole question of labor, and what unfolds post-1865 is another story for another day. In this book, there's a lot of discussion as well about Oklahoma, formerly Indian Territory, which was supposed to be this major Bantustan on the northern border of Texas. And so what happens, and this is to me one of the more informative episodes in US history, is that you had certain indigenous populations who were seeking to assimilate. For example, the Cherokees of the southeast quadrant of North America. So they started dressing like the settlers, they adopted Christianity, they began enslaving Africans. They still had to go on the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory, with European settlers just off the boat, oftentimes moving into their mansions. And I'm sorry if that upsets people's ideas about solidarity, et cetera, but as we are maybe on the cusp of fascism, a harsh dose of reality might be just the medicine we need nowadays. In any case, so what happens is that many of the Cherokee leaders wound up fighting with the Confederates. The last a Confederate officer to surrender in June 1865 was Stand, S-T-A-N-D, Watie, W-A-T-I-E. So what happens, however, is that Washington forces more harsh abolitionist measures on the indigenous enslavers as opposed to the Euro-American enslavers in terms of what amounts in some cases to reparations, which is still the order of the day. You know that in Sacramento, that's being debated as we speak. By the way, I interviewed one of the members of the reparations task force, Jovan Lewis of UC Berkeley, chairman of the geography department, on my show on KPFK, Los Angeles, Pacific Station, Los Angeles. The show is Freedom Now, 11 a.m. Pacific, Saturdays, check it out. But in any case, so what happens is that there is a bump in wealth of certain Black people in Oklahoma following 1865. But I'm sure you know the next chapter in the story, 1921, the Tulsa Massacre, whereby on flimsy pretenses, there's a mass pogrom executed against Black people, and basically their wealth is taken from them, many of them fleeing to the four corners of North America. And of course, this also intersects with the story of oil. You may already know about Spindletop and the gushers in Southeast Texas at the beginning of the 20th century. Some of those gushers can be found in the oil that was taken from Black people in 1921. And then those gushers helped to create this class of fabulously wealthy individuals. To fast forward, as I come to a conclusion, some of whom are regarded as the richest people in the world. I'm speaking of the Cullen family of Houston, the Burchesons of Dallas, the H.L. Hunt, or the Hunt family of Dallas. Of course, a descendant of that family still owns the so-called Kansas City Chiefs football team. And these Texas oil men had a malignant influence on the US government. Joseph McCarthy was considered to be the third senator from Texas, not least because he was supported so handsomely by these Texas oil men. I should also say that, and needless to say, there was opposition to this reign of terror throughout. Slave rebellions made reference to the opposition of the Comanches. By the 1930s, you had a communist party in Texas centered around, in terms of its strength, around San Antonio. That's mentioned in the book if anybody wants to follow up. However, I don't find it accidental that the right wing has controlled every state office in the state of Texas since the early 1990s. I don't find it accidental that this question of class collaboration, descendants of the original settler class uniting arm in arm across class lines, which I think is part of the key of understanding the Trump phenomenon and January 6th, that noxious phenomenon has reached a kind of apex in the Lone Star State. Let me also say this to give you a sneak preview. So on September 11th, I'm speaking at the first international conference of the US Communist Party in its 102-year history. And one of the points I will be making is that desperately in this country, we need an immediate resuscitation of international solidarity. Being a person who's written on the history of the US Communist Party, you can put my name in a search engine and a number of books will come up. There used to be this concept of Southern solidarity, whereby people, members in New York would have a special assessment for organizing in the South. We need to internationalize that phenomenon because the United States is beating the war drums with regard to China. Even Henry Kissinger, the war criminal du jour has warned about this dangerous path, given the fact that that could lead the entire planet over the cliff. And I'm afraid to say, although people in the United States don't like to hear it, although it's obvious, given the fact that progressive forces need some backup in this country, we need the global equivalent of Southern solidarity. That is to say, these forces need to make special assessments. Now, this could be mutually beneficial if that somehow violates the tax regime. They can just buy more books from international publishers, for example. Likewise, we need more exchange of cadre. I would like to see, if it can spare it, the U.S. Communist Party send cadre to Swaziland, for example. It would be a payment on a historical debt. If the South African Communist Party would send assistance to the United States, ditto for India. So I'll end on that note, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Horne, and we are going to have our discussion and Q&A start in a few minutes. I'm gratified to see we have 37 people here. But first, we need to have a couple of announcements. Jean, would you like to say something about future programs?
Yes, that is exactly what I would like to do. Well, thank you so much, Gerald. This was really interesting and really kind of a lot of things I need to get my head around. But in the meantime, next week, August 28th, we have an excellent program with our comrade Steve Zeltzer, LEPAIO, the Labor Education Project on the AFL-CIO International Relations. And I think that's something we really need to look at. And Steve Zeltzer and Professor Kim Skypes will be speaking on this newly formed organization, which I think is very important. And then coming on, we still don't have it scheduled, but in light of the comments that Gerald made on the Constitution, we do have a program coming up, We the Elites, Why the U.S. Constitution Serves the Few. And we're still working out the scheduling on that. But we have some good programs coming up. Looking forward to our discussion today and looking forward to seeing more people in the future. So back to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Jean. And we always welcome anyone's suggestions about speakers. Now I'd like to ask Richard F. Do you want to say something about finances?
Yeah, thank you. I placed a message in the chat describing how you can contribute to the work of ICSS financially. And the same information is on the email that you received announcing this meeting. And it's also on our website, icss.org, icssmarks.org, where you can make a contribution. And if you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up for our mailing list and you'll get announcements, regular announcements directly about our programs. So please give generously, and back to you, Sharon.
Thank you. So I would like to call on myself just to ask Gerald, if you would, to expand a little bit on how the effects of the genocide against Native people are manifest today. I mean, we understand, or hopefully more and more people understand, how the effects of slavery are manifest through up until today. But I fear that we often forget about the way in which the genocide against Native Americans that people don't want to talk about because it's so embarrassing, still abide today. I give you an example. In my mind, we're having a big initiative on the ballot in in California about whether or not to approve online betting. And the people who are in the forefront of arguing for and against it are on the cable TV are Native American tribes. And it seems like the impression that we're supposed to get is there are some very rich tribes, and they don't want to have this online betting which would be taxed, of course, is the whole point is to get tax dollars. It would impact their tribal casinos, which is so lucrative for them. And then there are the poor tribes coming out saying, no, you should support online betting because it's only those rich guys that want to have more. And we poor tribes, will actually benefit from those extra tax dollars. And to me, it raised in my mind the question, which had occurred to me before, but I never figured it out or spent the time doing the research, I guess. But, why is it that we just go along with this notion that if you're a Native American, you get to have a career in a tribal casino? Why can't we have more full development of Native American people? So anybody born into a Native American community could have the full benefit of anything they wanted to do in life. I just feel like there's a history here of saying, okay, you get the casino business, you guys, and shut up. Do you have any comment about that, Gerald?
Well, I mean, with regard to the latter point, it's the same reason why you don't have universal health care in the United States. You have very powerful bodies, oftentimes, once again, across class lines, who are opposed to any sort of benefit, particularly if you look at, in order to understand this Trump phenomenon, it's apparent that the election of the 44th US president, despite the fact that he rarely, if ever, veered beyond the mainstream, was triggering for many within the descendants of the settler class. And you only have to look at the historical reaction to so-called Obamacare and the rise of the Tea Party about a decade or so ago, and the birtherism movement, for example. Now, that helps to shed light on why it is that Native Americans, by some measures, are the demographic doing worse than any other in the United States of America. As historians like to say, it should not be seen as accidental that in addition to the South, which was the hotbed of enslavement, that the other base of the ultra-right wing is the West, particularly places like the Dakotas, Wyoming, the home of Liz Cheney, for example, which tend to have significant indigenous populations, also, surprise, surprise, have significant right-wing movements. Now, in terms of the impact of the genocide on the United States today, you need look no further on the once vaunted, now reviled, at least in certain circles, US Constitution. I recall not so long ago, people on the left were celebrating the Bill of Rights, for example, even celebrating these movements that come out of the 18th century, applying them to the 21st century. I won't embarrass anyone by being more specific. However, if you look at the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, you have to wonder, what were these people smoking when they started trying to celebrate the Bill of Rights? Because the basis for the Second Amendment was to have settler militias who could suppress revolts of the enslaved and suppress indigenous revolts. Certainly the Second Amendment did not apply to Black people, like most of the Bill of Rights, for example, under slavery. If it had, I guarantee you that slavery would have ended before 1865. And if you're familiar with this, what I would like to think is this now discredited genre of the Hollywood Western, there was oftentimes no more villainous character than the settler who sold arms to Native Americans. That should be a tip-off to what the Second Amendment was all about. And of course, I could go down the other amendments. I mean, this veers from the topic, but I'll mention it anyway. Take the vaunted First Amendment, for example, of freedom of religion. I was just reading some correspondence from James Madison, the former US president at the beginning of the 19th century, during the height of the so-called Barbary Wars. You may recall the Marine hymn from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, because these Euro-American settlers, when they were on boats, oftentimes sailing to enslave Africans, they'd find themselves enslaved in Algeria, Tunis, Tripoli, etc. And so James Madison in this letter was saying, you know what? I think that having some sort of ratification of freedom of religion will distinguish us appropriately from Western Europeans, because the British were having the same problem. And in fact, most of Western Europeans were having the same problem. And so in other words, they felt that these predominantly Muslim populations in North Africa, they would resonate with the idea of freedom of religion and would not be so prone as to snatch Euro-American settlers off of boats and then sell them into the slave markets in Algeria, perhaps onward into what is now Istanbul. So once again, for whatever reason, part of the problem in the United States has been that people have deserted their own principles. They're supposed to be into material analysis. But when it comes to things like the Bill of Rights, you think that all of these are just springing spontaneously from the fertile brains of these brilliant men, for example, as opposed to being driven by material conditions. And likewise, with regard to class, they have generally tried to impute class collaboration to the class of unpaid workers, otherwise known as slaves, in order for the US narrative to make sense. In other words, you have, even though historians have known for decades that the class of unpaid workers did not necessarily support the revolt against British rule, and then capitalized in the August 1814 by helping the Redcoats torch Washington, DC, sending James Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets. We're marking today, as a matter of fact, the 206th anniversary of some of those Negroes in Washington, DC, fleeing on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. They're called the Americans, M-E-R-I-K-I-N-S. They are a class of individuals in Trinidad. And so, as I said, if we're not careful, we'll have plenty of time to discuss this in the concentration camps at Oakland A's baseball stadium.
Okay, I see two hands. So the stack now is Roger and then Raj. Go ahead, Roger.
Thank you, Gerald, for your presentation. I had very high expectations, and they weren't at all disappointed as usual. Very much appreciate you coming and joining us. I'd like to get into the issue of contemporary fascism, but first, I'd like to go back to one of the historical things that you mentioned, I think was quite important. And that, as you mentioned in passing, the holiday of Cinco de Mayo, which most of us people here in the United States, we think of that as a Mexican holiday. But as you pointed out, that particular battle, the first battle of Puebla, I think it was 1862, had profound influence on U.S. history. And if you could please elaborate on that, because next time May 5th comes around, we should be celebrating not only for the Mexicans, but we should be celebrating for our own sake as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, keep in mind that these enslavers were not only seeking to flee to Mexico. In my book on Cuba, I talk about how they moved to Cuba. My book on Brazil, I talk about how they moved to Brazil. I wrote a book on the South Seas, who talked about absent their enslaved property, many of them decamped to the South Pacific, where they become involved in a process of enslaving Melanesians and Polynesians. And the Kingdom of Hawaii seeks to intercede, and for its troubles is overthrown, becoming a US colony, then a US state. However, the most significant migration, understandably, was just south of the border to Mexico. And of course, bringing their enslaved property in tow, backed up by the French puppet. And needless to say, there had been a substantial amount of anti-US expansionist sentiment in Mexico. And one can make an argument that that sentiment still persists to a same degree. I mean, after all, the United States was able to seize a significant percentage of Mexican territory, including the land on which many of you are now sitting in the state of California. And so this idea that the French puppet Maximilian was going to be allying with these men from Dixie in terms of running the running the Mexican government, it did not go down very well south of the border. And so understandably, there were mass uprisings. You mentioned 1862, culminating in 1867. So there's more of that in the book, which I recommend to your attention.
Raj is next.
Thank you, Gerald. So you made a connection of this history to Trump phenomena. And so I wanted to ask you if you see the Trump movement, if I don't misunderstand you, it's kind of a neo-fascist movement. And if so, of course, you're criticizing the liberals, which is correct. And so do you see it, can you expand on it in what is the, and I agree with you, international solidarity, but this phenomena, can you talk a little more about your views on the Trump phenomena as you developed it in your talk, a little bit further on that? Thank you.
Well, let me begin by saying that there was an article, you're probably familiar with Portside, this sort of electronic bulletin board that sends out information for the left. They had a piece just last week by this left-leaning writer by the name of Stephanie Kuntz, who's written some intelligent books on feminism and marriage, but she strayed outside of her lane because she was saying that there's this tendency on the left to be too reproachful when dealing with history of the United States of America, stressing what she considers to be the negative aspects. And since we had just passed August 15th and the 75th anniversary of Indian independence, what that brought to mind was this discourse in India, where Neil Ferguson, he's one of your homeboys too, he's at the Hoover Institute at Palo Alto. He has this line where saying, well, you know, the British colonialists, they built railroads, they left laws, you know, they left the English language, so come on, let's be fair and balanced when it comes to dealing with British colonialism. And of course, that did not go down very well in New Delhi, to put it mild, at least in most quarters. And so likewise, I think we would be well advised to take a similar attitude towards the history of this bloody country. And with regard to the Trump phenomenon, as noted, I think that you saw a kind of microcosm, if not a macrocosm, on January 6, 2021, where you had CEOs, you had shopkeepers, you had police officers, military veterans, you had working class elements, you had men, women, you had people who flew in on private planes and people who drove their jalopies. To get to 75 million after, in November 2020, after all the misdeeds and transgressions of the Trump phenomenon, it requires a certain kind of cross-class collaboration. And so likewise, as we look into our crystal ball and try to figure out what's going to happen in the November elections and then the elections after that, we should be alarmed by the rise of these stop the steal elements who are going to be controlling the counting of the vote in neighboring Arizona, perhaps in Michigan. If you look at these ultra-rightists who've been nominated to run for governor, like Mastriana in Pennsylvania, Cox in Maryland, Lake in Arizona. If you look at the defeat of Liz Cheney, if you look at the defeat of most of those who voted against Mr. Trump, it should set off alarm bells. And I think that a certain kind of neo-fascism that arises in the United States, it'll be interesting to compare it, assuming we have time, to fascism in other countries. In other words, I think it's probably fair to say that unlike in certain countries like Chile in the 1970s, or even South Africa before 1994, or Germany and Italy in the 1930s, it's not as if the fascist movement is arising because the left movement, socialists and the communists, are potent and powerful. So that's what I mean by a unique form of neo-fascism, because it's not necessarily going to be cookie cutter following the mode of previous fascisms. But at the same time, that should give us a note of optimism, because I think it's fair to say that an early and ultimate victim of neo-fascism in this country will be the Black working class in particular, and Black people in general. And despite some weaknesses ideologically and organizationally, I think that that may turn out to be a stumbling block for the ultimate rise of a certain kind of US neo-fascism. Sir, I would entertain any comment you would have as well.
Well,
Go ahead if you want. Mm-hmm.
I do that separately sometimes with you, Gerald, but I will thank you very much for your answer. I'll think about that.
Okay. Next is Grover, followed by Jean.
All right. Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Horne. I'm going to have a hip replacement operation in a couple of weeks, and I am gathering up. I've already gotten 2 of your books. I'm going to get a couple of more. I'll have some time to do some reading, and I really want to devote some serious time to reading some of your works. I have a couple of questions, but I'm only going to ask one at this time. You talk and write about settler colonialism and cross-class collaboration, and some interpretations of the concept of settler colonialism and its history in the United States basically state that class struggle, working class unity is impossible in the United States because of its history of class collaborationism and settler colonialism. And that, of course, would mean, if it were the case, that that Marxist analysis has been superseded or no longer applies, if it ever did apply to in the United States. So I'd just like you to tell us explain to us a little bit about how you see the relationship between sort of classic Marxist class analysis and the reality of settler colonialism and its relationship to class collaborationism.
Well, as I've already suggested, I think that the idea that class struggle is impossible under settler colonialism is ridiculous. I spent quite a bit of time talking about the revolt of unpaid workers.
Yes.
In fact, I ended my last comment talking about what I perceive to be the continuing tradition of class struggle in the descendants of unpaid workers, which helps to explain why it's the demographic most likely to vote against the right wing, sometimes 9-1, 8-2, regularly.
Mhm.
And part of the problem with, quote, Marxist analysis, unquote, is one, no sort of analysis of the Haitian Revolution. I thought folks were into revolts of workers. You had it in this hemisphere. It had dynamic impact on the history of this country. And yet people at the time and people hardly since have discussed it. And so that's why I mentioned that point a few moments ago about people deserting their own ideology. I mean, their ideology is supposed to be about class struggle, materialism, but somehow that flies out the window under certain circumstances. The other point that I would make is that I think that there has been an underestimation by certain precincts on the left, and certainly by many liberals, of the impact of international events on the United States. For example, the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, which gives rise to the International Labor Defense, which then intervenes on the Scottsboro case, which is akin to intervening in apartheid South Africa in the 1970s to the 1990s. In other words, it has a salutary impact on domestic conditions here in the United States, up to and including sending a shot of adrenaline into the mainstream of the labor movement in the 1930s, leading to the organizing of the CIO. Now, of course, there was a backlash against it. I've written about it at length. I've written about the ILWU in your own backyard in the Bay Area. I've written about the National Maritime Union, for example, both of which were CIO unions subjected to purges. But the fact that they could exist and persist suggests that even under these difficult conditions that obtain in North America, class struggle is clearly possible. But once again, I think that it becomes more likely when people return to their ideological way stations, battle stations, and stop being diverted. You know, you're the coach of the children's soccer team, and you tell the fullbacks who are supposed to be with the goalie to not venture so far away from the net. But whenever the ball heads downfield, the fullbacks, they head downfield too. They desert their battle stations. That's sort of a metaphor for what I'm afraid to say is not only too many individuals, but organizations, which I've already made reference to on the left.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 4 people on the stack: Jean, Mark, Richard W, and Richard F. Go ahead, Jean.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, this conversation's been very fruitful, and it's kind of hard for me to gather my own thoughts when so many new thoughts are coming in. And I just noted when you talked about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, you know, there's a book some time ago called Hegel and Haiti. And this woman makes the point that, you know, what was going on with the Haitian Revolution was clearly very important in Hegel's time, but Haiti is never mentioned in Hegel, nor is he ever mentioned. Haiti's not mentioned in Marx. I did a little word search in the Marx Engels Internet Library where you can look for various phrases and terms, and I can't find any mention of Haiti. And even when we look at, you know, the first working class revolution in history, we think is the Paris Commune, forgetting about the Haitian Revolution. So, and as you say, these were unpaid workers, and you know, it's something that maybe you'd like to comment on. But the other thing that I was thinking about also is, you know, as I said, January 6th isn't over yet. It's still unfolding, and we have a lot to be very concerned about. And part of this is, you know, the coming of fascism to America. One of the impacts of this, particularly the impending war with China that's being heightened these days, is that Asian Americans are really, and Chinese Americans, and I have two grandchildren who are Chinese Americans. So, but there's this increase of hate crimes and so forth. And, you know, the United States involvement in China goes way back to the Opium Wars and, you know, the wealth that came out of that. But more recently, you know, these hate crimes, you know, old women being beaten up in the streets because they're Chinese, or it's just incredible. So maybe, you know, there's a lot to worry about, and I try not to worry over much and realize that I live in one of the, you know, Oakland, Berkeley area is one of the civilized areas that I feel very fortunate I live here. But anyway, any comments you'd like to make? I just wanted to share those thoughts with you.
Well, I noticed in the LA Times this morning that there's going to be some memorial built in honor of the Chinese folk who were killed in a pogrom in 1871 in Los Angeles, which precedes the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And as you know, your area was redolent with anti-Asian bias. And in fact, I'm going to mention Tom Paine in a moment, but Jack London, who was a Bay Area socialist, Jack London Square in Oakland. Of course, he was a Asiaphobe of the first rank. And of course, supposedly a socialist of the first rank, which then brings me to your earlier point concerning the Haitian Revolution and the curious and mysterious absence of comment on it. I would also add to that list Tom Paine, who was considered, when you talk to these US leftists, they always like to bring up the name Tom Paine, you know, common sense. Leftists have written biographies of him, collected his works. He went, per your remarks, Hegel and Marx went better by commenting negatively on the Haitian Revolution. So I think people need to reflect deeply upon this. Once again, criticism and self-criticism is supposed to be a part of our movement's ethos. Perhaps we need a dose of that today. And then, of course, speaking of the Opium Wars, you probably know that the Delano family, per Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was up to his eyeballs in the opium trade. And we know, per the remarks of Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, which is now under assault by the ultra-right in light of the search at Mar-a-Lago. I can't remember the statistics, but it was something, so don't quote me on this, but it's something like they open a case against people of Chinese ancestry maybe every hour, something. And I'm sure you know about the cases involving Chinese and Chinese American academics who have come under scrutiny by the FBI. You probably remember the case some decades ago of Vincent Chin during the last burst of anti-Asian bigotry. This, of course, focused on Japan, you may recall. You could do worse than go back and look at some of Hollywood's movies on this, including Rising Sun with Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes, Mr. Baseball, Black Rain with Michael Douglas. And there was a lot of hysteria, you may recall, around Japan. And of course, he was Chinese American, beaten to death in Michigan because of anti-Japan hysteria. Don't ask me to unravel why a man of Chinese ancestry is killed because of anti-Tokyo sentiment, although I'm sure you can figure it out. So certainly, as the war drums continue to sound ever louder, particularly in the light, once again, of the visit of your homegirl, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan, which really has China on edge. I don't know if you look at the China Daily, but they are really, they're furious. It might help to explain why President Xi is going to break his self-imposed quarantine and not only go to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Central Asia in a few weeks, but continue. That, of course, is the counterpoint to NATO that includes Russia and Iran, but also travel on to Saudi Arabia, where I expect him to get a rapturous welcome, in contrast with the welcome accorded to the US President, Mr. Biden, just a few weeks ago.
Well, thank you. I just want to also mention, I'm sure you know about Jack London's infamous book, I forget the title of it, where in this book, he talks about how there is germ warfare that exterminates the entire Chinese race. And the few remaining elements are just murdered by the invading Americans that set up a new Caucasian empire in what used to be China. So there, I forget the title of that, but it's really a despicable book, but it's just part of our tradition, I think. And Jack London was a socialist from Oakland, as you mentioned.
Quote unquote.
Yeah.
Right. Well, anyway, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Okay, Mark, then Richard W., then Richard F. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Horne. Going back to what you were talking about, America's rise to fascism, when you read, and this is decades before Trump, and I think perhaps this bolsters what the argument you're making here, but in the more modern sense, if you read Mussolini's Charter of the Worker, April 1927, and then his expanded doctrine on fascism in June 1932, where the corporations, the big corporations, run your economy. And fascism is anti-individualistic. The only liberty worth having is the liberty of the state. The liberty of the individual is based on the liberty of the state. And Mussolini thought the ideas of the age of reason, age of enlightenment, liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, so on and so forth, were among the leading causes of 1914. In other words, you can't trust the common man to run a country. So how do you keep them in line? The corporate state. And I'll offer to you that America, long before Trump, has gone down this road. Your comments on that?
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking, I've mentioned thus far that under a unique form of US fascism, you can fully expect a considerable percentage of the Black working class to take it in the neck.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly they will not be alone, to put it mildly. In fact, I've seen articles that have said quite properly and appropriately that the front that you construct against this arising neo-fascism needs to be quite broad. Although interesting in these articles that I've read, they rarely talk about why. I mean, they don't seem like it's taboo to talk about a segment of the working class and middle class being part of the 75 million. Why they don't articulate that, I'm not sure, but they are proper and correct to say that the front needs to be broad. And I say that in part because already you can see in Florida, for example, with the conflict between Governor DeSantis and certain corporations that are seen to be overly, quote, woke, unquote, which is their epithet of the day, with regard to the campaign in the Wall Street Journal against ESG and corporations, environmental, social, and governmental guidelines, the coming battle about affirmative action, where many corporations have weighed in favor of affirmative action. I think that if there is a unique form of US fascism to come to pass, there will be certain corporations and corporate leaders that may have to take a haircut, as they say on Wall Street. Just like some are being asked to take a haircut with regard to their investments in China,
Right.
as we speak. And that's one of the reasons why I think it might be possible to build this broad front, which, as I said, people write about it and everybody nods their head. but then they don't really necessarily go into the details about why you need a broad front.
Well, I think what you're seeing, though, is I think corporate America has ruined the last vestiges of representative government. And so in 2016, Dr. Horne, you saw a backlash here. Those who the anti-establishment factions, those who supported Sanders, and those who supported that arrogant, self-absorbed constitutional illiterate from Queens. And it's not going to get any better. It's only going to get worse. It's not going to get any better here.
Well, I'm determined, as I'm sure you are, to prove that that is not accurate.
We'll see. Because Dr. Horne, I teach too. And I've been telling some of my students for the last 10 years that unless the progression that America is on is changed, we are going to be in a violent upheaval by the fourth decade, sometime in the fourth decade of this century. Now, if you do the math, that's the next decade.
I hear you.
Thank you, Mark. Next is Richard W.
And following up on Mark's observation, I'll probably be dead by then. And if not, we'll probably have an environmental crisis that will rival with that.
Mm-hmm.
I had a couple of observations. I'm over here in Austin, and I've been here for about 40 years now. So I'm very familiar with like the Republic of Texas gang and their cry for independence. And that's not going to go anywhere, in part because as soon as they declare their independence, that shrinks up all their funds coming from the federal government. And as we know, a lot of the South is very dependent. The military is dependent on it. There's a lot of processing that goes on here. So that's a faulty thing. My question to you is this: getting back to Marx for a second, you talk about. I guess my question is in Marx, labor is undifferentiated, and you've made a differentiation, I think, of the South using it for settler purposes, agricultural in particular, as cheap labor, agricultural. My question is, why is that not the case? Where's the difference between that and employing slaves in an industrial setting? Where's the difference in that? Thank you.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, first of all, the late Robin Sturobin wrote a book some years ago on industrial slavery. That is to say, you had enslaved Africans working in industry, not least in Philadelphia. Second of all, with regard to, not least in Virginia, I should have said. Second of all, with regard to slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line, it had a persistence and a stickiness that may surprise some who are accustomed to discussing the so-called abolitionist North and the so-called pro-slavery South. And in any case, we know that Philip S. Foner, one of his first books written over 80 years ago, talked about the role of Manhattan, New York City, in slavery and the slave trade. In fact, the Hartford Courant, one of the oldest newspapers in the United States, Courant, a few years ago did a series on the connection between Connecticut and the slave trade. To a certain extent, the slave trade was financed in the North, with the enslaved Africans then deposited in New Orleans and Galveston and Charleston, for example. So the entire country, the entire economy of the United States was implicated in enslavement, which is one of the reasons why one historian at NYU, his name escapes me at the moment, wrote in his last book that if you look at the lineup during the US Civil War, one of the reasons why the South lost, of course, is they had 180,000 Black soldiers, but also they attracted a number of immigrants from abroad to fight under the Stars and Stripes. But if you look at the Euro-American population, they were to be found in more significant numbers, according to this historian, under the Stars and Bars. So, as many people have suggested in their more sober and saner moments, slavery was not a sideshow. It was at center stage, and by some measure, it was the most valuable investment in the United States circa 1860. And certainly at the time of the so-called Glorious Revolution, one of the reasons why the merchant class was so eager to undermine the Royal African Company under the thumb of the monarch was because the profits were so spectacular. You could invest $1 and get 1,700 back. I mean, there are people today who still.
If I can interrupt you for a second. I know. In the North there was a financial aspect that was going on. The banks were making large money off of the slave trade. Don't deny that. Take it out of the North-South context. What about in the case of, say, England or France, or why wasn't there slaves more in the industrial process there than in the South agricultural? I mean, where the labor is, quote, labor is labor. It's labor power. Why? What differentiates it, in the South, in the agricultural context, versus in an industrial context, if you could?
Well, to begin where I began a few moments ago with the phrase, if I understand the question, if you look at the work of Joseph Inokore at the University of Rochester, who happens to be of Nigerian descent, his book, Africans in the Industrial Revolution in England, of course, a lot of the capital that fed the Industrial Revolution in Manchester and in England came precisely from either the slave trade or the fruits of slavery. The other point is that another question to ask, which I've answered in part in previous work, is why drag the Africans all the way across the Atlantic? Why not enslave them in Africa itself? Well, of course, that was considered and attempted not only in the 1500s, but also post-1865, when you may have noted that a moment or two ago, I talked about how the enslavers, they were moving to Cuba, Brazil, Mexico. They're also moving to Northeast Africa, where, of course, there had been a long-term slave trade in Egypt that they were going to not only capitalize on, but expand by organizing armed forces to invade southward. Now, why more Africans were not brought to, say, London and Paris? Well, first of all, I talk about in my 16th century book how Queen Elizabeth herself, who was up to her elbows in the early stages of the African slave trade, like a resident of Atherton, California in 2022, was complaining about the changing character of the neighborhood as more Africans were arriving in London. And in fact, if you look at that book, one of the points that you'll note, I'm sure, is that contrary to all the discussion about the 1619 Project, which of course I supported, but if you look at the early stages of the African slave trade in England, there were Africans being imported into England, but mostly for household labor, which then ties in to another point, which we have not discussed to this juncture, which is the point of perhaps a majority of Euro-American women across class lines voting for Mr. Trump. And of course, once again, one of your colleagues at UC Berkeley wrote a book precisely on this subject about Euro-American women and slavery.
Wow, there's so much to think about. Thank you. Richard F., you're next.
Thank you. I was wondering about, I've been puzzled. Well, we seem to have multiple fascisms in this country. And not only the Trump-aligned fascism, but the fascism that is in power, firmly in power in the country. Not only the fascism that's contending for power, but the one that's already in power, the one that's the pivot to Asia and the war in Ukraine and stepping up of nuclear weapons and so forth. Do you think I think there's a kind of dialectic between those two fascisms, or at least extremism. So we get these anomalies like Liz Cheney, who's ultimate fascism, and she's thrown out by these other people, or Bush being, not Bush, but Trump being attacked for being too friendly to the Russians. And, he was crucified for that. Your comment, I wonder if you have thoughts about it.
I do. Let me say that I'm going to have to sign off in about 10 minutes. And also the juice on my laptop is running down. So I'm going to have to run and get my cord and get electricity. So hold on for a second.
Okay, let's just be patient and let Dr. Horne do that.
I just wanted to discuss what Richard Wright wrote as asked the question. Capitalism is more dynamic with free labor. Those who have read Marx's Capital, and was a special condition. It was kind of like a enclosure movement of England, where people were driven out of the land to herded into the city to start. So this was its equivalent in America, herded these slavers into developing a very difficult industrial agriculture. So I think after that, it becomes a regressive thing. That will be my opinion.
Okay,
I would like Professor Horne's response to that. Actually, just quickly, I just added to Richard Wright's comment, a question that I think industrial capitalism is based, as you know, for Marx's writing, on free labor. So it was a special case of slavery was because it was being initiated here, kind of like the enclosures movement in England, where the people were herded into the cities. So this was just to jumpstart that kind of what would say is a primitive accumulation technique, after which it becomes regressive. And that's why the industrial capitalists, when they developed, would put a stop to it, because otherwise it'll hinder the development of capitalism in the United States. And you can comment on that or go to Richard. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem, no problem. Of course, unpaid labor still persists in the United States. Oftentimes it goes under the name wage theft. You might have recalled the case a few years ago of immigrant workers burned to death at a plant in Los Angeles, for example. Oftentimes you have affluent forces from abroad who will bring unpaid labor to serve as, quote, servants, unquote, in their homes. The Justice Department is still prosecuting cases along that line. And in fact, I mentioned a moment or two ago, a couple of points. One, a critique of Black leadership, which was not sufficiently vocal in opposing the Buffalo Soldiers, as they were called, and routing the Native Americans. And the other, in terms of after freedom in the United States, abolition in the United States, they should have conducted a worldwide campaign. That should have been the next step, because that's what Haiti did. after the revolution succeeded in 1804, excuse me, they realized that re-enslavement was possible as long as slavery persisted in the hemisphere. Now, with regard to the previous question, I think there's some anomalies in US politics that are explicable. That is to say, part of the problem with the reigning Democratic Party, as the questioner's comment suggested, is that, as Henry Kissinger has pointed out, they've stumbled into this cul-de-sac of confronting Russia and China simultaneously, although I think an honest assessment would conclude that part of the key to the creation of the unipolar world, so-called, was winning China over against Russia post-1972, winning against Moscow post-1972. And part of this has to do with what happened during the Red Scare, approximately 75 years ago, when the major Black organization, the NAACP, was induced to sign on to anti-communism in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, and then throw overboard Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ferdinand Smith, Claudia Jones, the more far-sighted, internationally minded leaders. And so a similar process afflicted the CIO, as I mentioned a moment or two ago, with regard to the purge of the ILWU, people like Ferdinand Smith, the attack on Harry Bridges, et cetera. And so today you still have an international department. The AFL-CIO, of course, tends to be in the corner of the Democratic Party, but their international department could just as well, even today, flourish under a Republican regime. And then the Black community is largely missing in action, for the most part, when it comes to foreign policy. Now, of course, episodically, there is opposition to, say, the war in Vietnam, for example, or the overthrow of the Bishop regime in Grenada. But as evidenced by the fact that accompanying your homegirl, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan was Congressman Gregory Meeks of the CBC, who of course has been similarly hawkish with regard to this. But this is a result of clear historical forces that I've just tried to articulate. The problem is that I think, as the questioner was suggesting, that kind of opportunism might be past the sell-by date. And it's a kind of opportunism that won't work, unquote, quote unquote. And it creates more problems than it resolves.
Okay, Janet, you're next. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go back in history, and I hope I have my history correct. Prior to the American Revolution, George Washington had a career serving the British in their colonization of North America. And he fought on behalf of the British against French colonialists in the American Indian Wars. He is considered the founding father of the United States, having fought against the British in the American Revolution. To me, what became the United States has been really part of a continuum of European colonization. The American Revolution was really white European settlers who came here wanting the land all to themselves, to control the colonization themselves, and to take control away from foreign countries. And although the U.S. Constitution introduced some democratic principles, much of its limitations and problems, like the Electoral College, the 3/5 clause, and the Second Amendment, to name just a few, there have been struggles there have been struggles to reform, reflected that. Some believe that the U.S. Constitution is fundamentally not reformable, especially because of property rights, which is the foundation of the theft of lands from Native Americans. So I'm wondering if you would comment on that.
Well, with regard to the latter, as I said, there's this op-ed in the New York Times this morning by these law professors we're basically saying the same thing about the US Constitution. The problem right now is that the correlation of forces is such in the United States, if you were to call a new constitutional convention, they probably bring back slavery. And so we can't ignore the lineup of forces when we talk about getting rid of today's Constitution, because we know about the 75 million strong from November 2020. We know about the capture or the impending capture of the Secretary of State offices in numerous countries, the people who, numerous states, the people who count the votes. And so, although I might say that I agree with you theoretically, I'm not sure if practically this is the right moment to raise the issue of junking this claptrap of a constitution. With regard to Washington, as I say in my 1776 book, other than the desire to capitalize on free labor, as Britain in Somerset's case, 1772, which by the way has been depicted in the movie Belle, B-E-L-L-E, which I recommend, starring Gugu Mbatha Raw, who happens to be of South African and British descent. There was a fear that Somerset's case could leap, which abolished slavery, or seemed to abolish slavery in London, I should say, would leapfrog the Atlantic and jeopardize profits in North America. And then, of course, before that, a decade earlier, was the Royal Proclamation of 1762, 1763, whereby London had up to its keister in terms of fighting Native Americans and then turning the land over to real estate speculators like George Washington. That didn't seem like a good deal. And so the Royal Proclamation was seeking to keep the settlers from moving further west, causing London to expend blood and treasure to fight Native Americans, as I said, for the benefit of George Washington. That didn't seem like a good deal. And so, of course, the settlers kicked London out and proceeded not only west, but then across the Pacific to Hawaii, and then further west to the Philippines, and on and on and
on. Next is Grover. Grover, you're muted.
Great. Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I'd like to ask you, Professor Horne, about the ruling class. You know, we had in the Civil War, there were certainly significant economic contradictions between the ruling class of the North and the ruling class of the South, and that precipitated the Civil War. Now, I wonder how you view the contradictions within the American ruling class in the light of the Trump phenomena, and of course those forces who are anti-Trump. Do you see evolving or developing the kind of split or contradiction within the American ruling class that precipitated the Civil War, and in general, if that doesn't exist, then why would the American ruling class want to resort to fascism?
Well, first of all, with regard to this loose talk about Civil War, which, as you know, has captured headlines, I was invited on Iranian TV just a few days ago. You can find it on YouTube or on Press TV's website, to address this question of whether or not there'll be a civil war in the United States of America.
Right.
I'm not sure. I hope not. But in any case, I've already made reference to the contradictions in the U.S. ruling elite with regard to Florida, for example, attacking so-called woke corporations, attacking Major League Baseball because they pulled out of a particular city because they didn't like the way certain laws were going. So there are all sorts of fissures in the U.S. ruling elite. And as I said, some of them may be forced to take a haircut, which I hope that they are planning for on behalf of their shareholders. But I'm not sure if I understand the import of your question. That is to say, were you saying that the U.S. ruling class is united, so therefore there won't be a civil war? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm asking is, okay, we have the political actors, Trump and, for example, and the Republican Party. Those are the political actors, and Marxist analysis says that there are important economic ruling class forces behind the major political actors, and so the antagonism between the political parties today and between the Trumpies and the Democrats or the anti-Trumpies, on the political level, doesn't that suggest some sort of, as you said, fissure or contradiction within the American ruling class, and how, or is that incorrect? And how do you see that?
Well, sure, there are conflicts. I mean, there are conflicts in 1861. That's
right.
Why you had a sector of the ruling class that was expropriated without compensation.
That's right.
In 1776, some of the ruling elite wound up fleeing to Bahamas and Canada.
Right.
After they were expropriated.
Right.
And so with regard to the history of North America, it would not be unusual for a sector of the ruling class to take a haircut, which is what I keep saying. And whether or not that will prevent the rise of fascism is a separate issue, it seems to me.
But you don't, would you care to identify the sectors of the ruling class that may have to, be penalized, take this haircut if you want?
Well, it's interesting. The political scientist Thomas Ferguson wrote some years ago that the Democratic Party tends to be dependent upon the sectors of capital, such as Hollywood, such as finance capital, and the Republicans oftentimes are more dependent upon sectors of capital that have labor forces, more significant labor forces. I'm not sure if that still holds. The book came out about 20 or 30 years ago, but you can say, just from reading the Wall Street Journal, that the campaign against ESG, which I mentioned a moment or two ago, is basically a campaign against finance capital. It's a campaign against BlackRock. It's a campaign to a degree against the Carlyle Group. Of course, Carlyle Group just gave its former co-CEO Glenn Youngkin to the Cavalier State, where he now serves as governor, running elected on an anti-critical race theory campaign, actually campaigning against Toni Morrison, believe it or not. So there are still these splits within capital. What do you think? So obviously you've thought about it.
I don't know. You started to talk about the finance capital plus other forces in support of the, that tend to support the Democrats versus the Eastern liberal establishment, if you want, versus those who support the Republicans being more large employers of labor. Another way to look at it might be capitalists. I mean, but not my idea, but just to thinking about other analyses that are out there. Those who are more focused on domestic production and maybe Asia versus those in the East who are perhaps devoted to strong economic and therefore political ties with Europe. I noticed that some of the very conservative, right-wing Republicans have been criticizing the war, the United States support for Ukraine and the war, saying who needs Ukraine? So there seems to be behind here. So I don't see it clearly, but it seems to me that behind these kinds of political conflicts, there are certain economic contradictions among the elites in the United States. And I just wondered, with your scholarship on the United States, what how you understand this.
Well, before we go to the next question, let me just make a final point, which is that in terms of your calculations, you need to consider that we have a new verb, restore. That is to say, you have this trend now of US corporate interests who were sending many of their staff, et cetera, abroad for various reasons or bringing it home. Now, there are various ways to interpret that. You could put that in the context of the conflict with China. You could put it in the context of the fact, which is obvious, but the US left doesn't like to hear it, that the US is the bastion of the global right wing, and therefore property may be considered to be more secure on these shores, as opposed to, say, even in Mexico, for example. So what will be the impact of reshoring on neo-fascist trends? It's premature to say.
Okay, thank you.
One other thing that Grover said that I think is important is that the ruling class doesn't want, as a whole, in generally speaking, doesn't want to rule with fascism. They want to rule with a liberal veneer of democracy, if it is all possible. So I feel like the fissures are becoming more obvious, and they want peace. They don't want upheaval from the working class. They don't want the working class to unite. They want to keep us separated. Having an autocrat in power, having a fascist in power, having a crazy person in power will tend to unite us more readily, maybe, hopefully. But from their point of view, it's not a good thing. So I think they would rather have DeSantis, who, is just every bit as right wing as Trump, but he's just a little saner, a little more controllable by capital. I'm going to call on Raj and Eugene because I don't see anyone else raising their hand who has not spoken already. So go ahead, Raj.
I'll make a comment if I can get it in here. It's just one line. Sharon, what you described is what the plantation owner would have wanted. Any plantation owner would have wanted peace among the slaves.
Yes. Okay, go ahead, Raj.
Okay, yeah, on this question that Grover, Professor Furr raised with you, Professor Horne, it seems to me that rise of fascism, as Marxists have studied this phenomena, is associated with crisis of capitalism. And the crisis, I think it seems to me, and I like your comment, your thoughts on it, is that the emergence of a second pole, which is China. And that pole is not controllable now. And this is the problem, that the rise of China with tremendous amount of capital is very difficult to fight with. And war is also just about impossible with uniting with Russia, China, and United. So the crisis and how it has affected the working class under imperialism is bought out by bribing certain layers. We know that. Lenin made that clear. And that was the case with England during the Russian Revolution thereafter in France. And was the case with the United States after the Second World War. But what happened was that was the bribe layers of the working class were primarily the better paid industrial workers, which were white. And so therefore they had no, notice how little the working class of that section was involved in anti-Vietnam War movement, which was my first experience here in getting political. So today what has happened is this section of it has gone down. When you talk about 75 million votes, these are the people, the lower half of the working class in the United States, which certainly includes the blacks, but the blacks have always suffered, okay, blacks and other minority groups. So this section has become now very disaffected. And the question is, two visions of how this crisis can be resolved. It looks like the liberals think that by greater imperialism around the world, they can do it and pacify the working class in the United States, as they have done before. And the Trumpian section of the ruling class thinks we have to do it another way. Suppress the, lower the wages of American workers by dividing them across the race divide and ethnic divide. I would like your comment on that.
Well, I'm afraid that I have to jump to another interview, believe it or not.
Okay.
In a few minutes, so I won't be able to elaborate in any detail. And plus, there's not that much to add to what you've just said. Other than obviously the deal with China backfired spectacularly. I'm still stunned. There's not much more discussion of that, about how the United States helped to create this juggernaut because of their anti-Moscow hysteria. And this is what it has led to. So hopefully it will not end in war, although I hope also that Sharon is correct that there's at least a sector of the ruling class, perhaps I would hope that she's correct, that there are those in the ruling class who do not want war. But I can't say that I'm that optimistic. So anyway, thank you all very much for your attention. I appreciate, the invitation.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
All right, look, good
Thank
luck.
you, Gerald. This was outstanding. Thank you.
I think we're going to end the recording soon. Let me just call on Jean, and then we can do that and have a little bit of further discussion. Jean, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, this has to do with, again, the international situation. I mean, after World War I, as we know, the United States built this empire, and which involved nuclear weapons, control the financial system, the whole thing. And there's one school of thought that tends to see China as simply replicating this as a new empire. And I think that's just a total misrepresentation of what's going on. If you look at, China and the way it conceives itself, it is, socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And that new era is one in which China has restored itself to its original position 200 years ago, when it was the dominating factor in East Asia. And now we're also in a situation where, where the Rand Corporation does these war games and so forth. What's going to happen if a war breaks out in, over Taiwan or in East Asia? And they invariably have China winning, not the United States. And of course, then the next step that they don't really take is, well, the United States is going to, of course, exercise its nuclear option. But I just want to throw that out that we're in a new situation. China is in a dominating situation. And for me, this is not a contest between two imperialist systems. It's a contest between imperialism and communism. So I just wanted to throw that out. I know there are those that may have different views, but I just wanted to express my own. And I wish Gerald were still here. But thank you.
We all do, but we're happy to have had him that long. Raj, could you please stop the recording now?